All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a pretty heavy topic, the complex, multivariable causes behind statistical group disparities. Now, this is a topic that often generates a whole lot of heat, but our goal here today is to generate light. We're going to look strictly at the data and the structural realities that shape human outcomes, drawing directly from Thomas Sowell's deeply analytical work on the subject.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at defining three distinct types of discrimination, how markets and cost factor in, the surprising role of geography, demographics in the age gap, human capital starting in the home, and finally, revealed preferences versus surveys. Let's get right to it.
Section 1. Defining three discrimination types. We really need to pin down our terms before we dive into the data. So when we spot a gap in outcomes between different groups, whether that's in employment, income, or whatever it might be, our gut reaction, we assume unfairness. We think, somebody somewhere made a biased decision. But is that actually always mathematically accurate? Or are there, other massive structural gears turning behind the scenes?
To answer that, Thomas Sowell breaks this down clinically into three distinct types of discrimination. First up, Discrimination IA. This is the gold standard, judging every single person strictly as an individual, totally regardless of their group. But let's be real, gathering that perfect individual data is super expensive and time-consuming. Then there's Discrimination IB. This is when people rely on empirical, group-based generalizations simply because getting individual info costs way too much. And finally, Discrimination II. This is treating people poorly based purely on arbitrary animus or hatred. This is exactly what pops into our heads when we hear the word discrimination.
Now, look at how Discrimination IB functions as a tool for managing risk rather than just a measure of personal prejudice. Say an employer is deciding whether to run criminal background checks. If the job doesn't really justify the huge cost of a background check for every single applicant, they might look at broader group data to see which demographic has a higher statistical probability of a record. They're not doing this out of hatred, they're doing it because the cost of individualized knowledge, that Discrimination IA, is just prohibitively high.
So here's the crucial balancing act. We absolutely have to acknowledge the real frustration of someone who feels like a victim here, someone unfairly judged by a group average under Discrimination IB. If you're an innocent person lumped into a high-risk category, well, that feels incredibly unjust. But we also need to simultaneously understand the rational risk mitigation math driving the decision-makers. Discrimination II, though, that is economically irrational behavior. It's just an arbitrary aversion completely detached from actual empirical reality.
Moving on to Section 2. Markets, costs, and bias. Let's see what happens when we introduce systemic market forces.
This quote right here brilliantly illustrates the power of market incentives. Following the American Civil War, white Southern landowners actually tried to organize and systematically suppress the pay of newly freed black sharecroppers. But as economist Robert Higgs researched, that cartel completely collapsed. Why? Because of competitive economic pressures. The intense agricultural urgency to get crops planted meant some landowners quietly broke the agreement, offering higher pay just to attract the best workers. So, competitive markets naturally subverted that organized discrimination too.
Market structure totally dictates the cost of bias. In a competitive market, the cost of discrimination II is incredibly high for the discriminator. If you refuse to hire the absolute best people because of arbitrary bias, your competitors are going to hire them, outcompete you, and drive you right out of business. But look at monopolies or government entities. Because they don't face competition, they're insulated from those financial hits. That is exactly why historically regulated monopolies like AT&T before the 1950s or state-run systems like apartheid South Africa could sustain severe discrimination too for decades. They literally just pass the cost of their own inefficiency right onto their captive consumers.
Section 3. Geography's role in disparities. Zooming way out, we've got to talk about the immense power of where we physically originate.
Geography is definitely not egalitarian. Take a look at this incredible historical fact. When Spaniards arrived in the extremely isolated Canary Islands back in the 15th century, they found a Caucasian population basically living in the Stone Age. Same thing happened when the British arrived in isolated Australia and found the Aboriginal population living at a similar level. Extreme geographic isolation left these groups lagging thousands of years behind technologically, and this was completely independent of any human bias or exploitation. It was literally just geographic luck and isolation from the global exchange of ideas.
Think about tornadoes for a second. They don't distribute themselves in a neat, even bell curve across the globe, right? They concentrate in specific areas, like Tornado Alley. Well, human capital and the economic prerequisites for wealth creation work the exact same way. They're highly concentrated by geographic luck. Navigable waterways, fertile soil, great climates, these things do not distribute equally. So expecting perfectly equal outcomes across all global populations kind of ignores the massive inherent inequality of the natural world itself.
All right, Section 4, Demographics and the Age Gap. Let's look at how the human element itself totally distorts outcome statistics.
20 years. That is a massive number. The median age of Japanese Americans is more than 2 decades older than the median age of Mexican Americans. Just think about what that actually means for statistical disparities. A demographic group with a median age in their 40s is obviously going to have way more work experience, higher education levels, and hit their peak earning years, compared to a group with a median age in their 20s. This is a stark demographic reality that inherently skews income stats before employer bias even enters the chat. Comparing average incomes here without adjusting for age is literally like comparing apples to oranges.
Which brings us to Section 5, Human Capital and the Home. Because a lot of these disparities begin way before the job market. They start right in the crib.
Sowell draws our attention here to what he calls pre-existing conditions. These are conditions that happen long before a job applicant ever sits down in front of an employer, and they can easily produce disparate impacts. These statistical disparities happen completely independent of whether that employer practices discrimination IA, IB, or II. You literally cannot tell where the disparity in individual capabilities originated just by looking at the outcome statistics at the employer's office.
And this perfectly illustrates the famous word gap. Studies show that children raised in families with professional backgrounds hear nearly twice as many words per hour as children in working-class families, and over 3 times as many as kids in families on welfare. That is huge! It shows us that pre-existing human capital differences are deeply ingrained into a child's cognitive development long before they ever fill out a job application. By the time they enter the workforce, the disparity's already set in stone. Finally, Section 6, Revealed Preferences versus Surveys. How do we actually measure the cultural values driving these different outcomes? Well, there are 2 vastly different ways to measure this. Sociologists like William Julius Wilson often rely on surveys, and Wilson's surveys showed that marginalized groups in inner-city neighborhoods verbally endorse the work ethic just as enthusiastically as anyone else. But economists, they prefer a concept called revealed preference. This means looking not at what people say, but what they actually do with their time and resources. For example, a Columbia University survey found 59% of low-income folks said buying goods on credit was a bad idea, yet most of those exact same families actively use credit for major purchases. When it comes down to it, actions speak louder and way more accurately than words on a survey.
The Shaker Heights study provides incredible empirical evidence of these revealed preferences in action. In the exact same affluent, integrated school district, researchers looked at time allocation. They found that Black students spent less time on their schoolwork and more time watching television compared to their white classmates, while Asian American students devoted the absolute greatest amount of time to their schoolwork. These behavioral choices, these revealed preferences regarding how time is invested, directly map onto the statistical disparities we later see in academic and economic outcomes.
So here's the big question we're left with. If we misdiagnose the root causes of disparities by ignoring geography, ignoring massive median age differences, and ignoring revealed behavioral preferences, how can we ever hope to create policies that actually help people? By removing our ideological blinders and utilizing this broader, strictly analytical framework, we really have to wonder what other well-intentioned solutions are currently built on totally flawed assumptions. It really forces us to look past the surface and grapple with the world as it actually is. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope this helps shed some light on the data behind the debate.